So we've been talking through this Unqualified series, and kind of the key takeaway is God doesn't call the qualified, but rather He qualifies the called. So why did you think that this series needed to be preached at Encounter?
I think that it comes back to who we think that we are and who God tells us who we are through the stories in the Bible. You see, most of the time we think that unless that we have attained some level of perfection of the people in the Bible, that they're extraordinarily competent or proficient in some area, they're so incredibly qualified that they attain this level that now God can use them. And what happens in that is it's completely paralyzing or debilitating to think, unless I'm there at that point, then God can't use me. And so we never think that we can actually be used by God. But when we open up the Bible and we start to read these stories about people who are dramatically underqualified, then we start to see that God actually seems to prefer to use broken, disqualified people like us for His good things. And it finally gives us the freedom to say yes to whatever it is that God might be asking us to do.
Awesome. So going back to this last Sunday, you talked specifically about Gideon and kind of for us that we are like Gideon and God might be calling us to do something, and rather that we shouldn't wait for other people in our lives to do things. You gave two examples of maybe being in a relationship that you aren't ready to commit to, maybe you're being called to get out of that relationship, or maybe switch professions or jobs. So what do you do if you take that leap in faith and it seemingly at the time isn't what God wanted or is working out?
Yeah, what happens when you say yes to being Gideon and not just waiting for Gideon, and it doesn't seem to work out? This is the tough part about what we think of when we think about being in the center of God's will, to use a language that a lot of people, including myself, like to use. We tend to consider the outcomes that determine whether or not we're in the center of God's will or not. When actually, I don't think it has anything to do with what the outcomes are, because if you can imagine this grand, infinite God, He cares less about what happens in the next year or 5 years than what happens in the next 100 years, or maybe infinity beyond that. He cares more about us living in Him, abiding in Him. He cares more about us than He does our external situation.
Awesome. You also talked about this kind of idea of regret versus repentance, which are definitely two distinct things, but maybe if you're in your own life, you're struggling a little bit, it's hard to tell the difference between the two during kind of a darker period, Right, yeah. So that distinction actually came from Timothy Keller, and what I think is really helpful about determining where you are, whether it's regret, which is more horizontal, or whether it's repentance, which is more vertical with horizontal implications. The difference of whether or not to know where you are in that is to simply ask the question, what happens if it doesn't work out? What happens if some external thing has been taken away from me? What happens if my reputation is damaged because I've been known as a Christ follower? Or what happens if there's a job change that I don't prefer? And if we're devastated by that, if there's a sense in which our identity is lost, then we knew that our identity was in those external circumstances. Then we knew that we're experiencing regret. But if we're experiencing true repentance, it's this vertical thing, then we know that we wouldn't just have those external things, we would have God Himself. And that is something that can never, ever be taken away from us.